All right, so I was asked Sunday to try and lead the class here. Uh, Talk about intimidation. I've got my father-in-law over there. I've got Alan over there. Bill, my dad watching on YouTube. It's fantastic. I really love it. Uh, Not to mention my mother over there. But for those of you that were here during the lectures, I talked a little bit about Elijah and Elisha, and um, I don't know, it's been on my mind lately, and I wanted to do a class on sort of that subject. But as I began studying it and becoming more familiar with it, uh, it sort of changed from Elijah and Elisha to more of a story about Jezebel. And so, if you'll sort of work with me here, I'll try to keep the train on the rails. All right. Um, let's switch some things up here. And who knew I always mocked Dad for, this big old table in front of the way. And I said, which means here I am using practically all of it as well. Anyway, okay. If you will, turn to Matthew the 17th chapter. You're going to hear me reading a lot today, so I'm probably going to let somebody else read Matthew 17 so that you don't get too bored of my voice. So Nathaniel, if you will, start there. You're going to be reading 17, 1 through 8. Yeah, that's fine. Well, I said 3, but it's okay. The point here is that Jesus is meeting with Elijah. Moses would seem to be the big one, but who is this Elijah? Why is he there? But yet the Jews seem to know him fairly well. And you have to ask yourself, why? What's the big story? I only hear about Elijah just a little itty bitty bit in the Bible. He actually had a much bigger role than that. If you look at the books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, he and Elisha are mentioned several times in their conquests and all of that. And that's sort of what I want to go into tonight. But like I said, I want to keep it on Elijah, but at the same time, I think to understand Elijah, you have to look at Ahab and Jezebel, and you have to look at the history of that association. So, Bob, would you mind reading 1 Kings 16, verses 30 through 33? 30 through 33. So Ahab is the king of Israel, building an altar and a temple to Baal because he married this wife, Jezebel. Now that'll come into play here in just a little bit, but it's something that I wanted to read to you. So I hope you don't get too bored with me. One of the things I did that is just that'll get me under fire for my dad is stealing books from his library. I'll put it back. But anyway, there's some good stuff here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read just a little from this page. Okay. Omri himself sealed an alliance with king of Tyre by the marriage of Ahab to the latter's daughter Jezebel. 1 Kings 16:31. The alliance was mutually advantageous. Tyre was at the height of her colonial expansion. Carthage was founded later in the century, being partly dependent on imports of foodstuffs. So she offered to Israel both an outlet for agricultural products and numerous commercial opportunities. Tyre, for her part, desired both a counterbalance to the power of Damascus and the reactivation of trade with Israel, and via Israel with the lands of the south. The next step was alliance with Judah. By early in Ahab's reign, if not before, this was formally arranged by the marriage of Ahab's sister, Athaliah, to Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. There is not the slightest reason to assume, as so many have, that this was not a friendly treaty between equals. The alliance was both military and commercial, for we read subsequently of an attempt to revive the overseas trade route of Ezion-Geber in 1 Kings 22. So my point here is that as you look at Jezebel and why Ahab married her, it was a trading card. It was an idea of combining two economies into one and having that advantage of agricultural and some commercial in the agricultural trade with Israel. Now, okay, so I wanted to switch this up a little bit tonight. And I want you to see it from not the advantage of history and reading to you all of that, but also applying it to today's world, which is something I don't know if you notice in my speeches or not, but I really, really try to apply it to today's society. And if you will look, and I thought I would do that with Elijah and Elisha, I really did, but it's actually Jezebel that I want to apply our current world to without getting into politics. But if you look at the state versus the individual, which you hear about here in America and worldwide all the time, the state versus the individual. If you will look at that from the perspective of Jezebel versus the Israelites versus the priests and their individual rights, you might see it from a slightly different point of view. And yeah, I was going to mention that, but I think I'm talking to myself, sorry. So I want to go on to tolerance. Take it from a page out of this book. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to memorize this, but if you will pay attention and listen, I think you'll see what I'm trying to get at. Fundamentally, their instinct was sound. In theory, tolerance was a broadening, civilizing policy. But actually, in Israel, remember, Jezebel is from Tyre, worshipped the gods of Tyre, and therefore brought her gods into Israel, into Samaria, planted her temple right there. And so King Ahab, of whom was an Israelite, allowed this, was tolerant of it, just like Solomon had been, just like many kings before him had been. And so I didn't get into that. So the idea of tolerance needs to be looked at. In theory, tolerance was a broadening, civilizing policy, but actually in Israel, you can apply Israel to America. It dissolved the unique outlook of the people. It weakened national loyalty. It destroyed the characteristics which distinguished Israel from other people. Worse still, since the Tyrian Baal worship had in it alluring immoral elements, it debilitated the national character. Tolerance of Baal meant tolerance of child sacrifice and sacred prostitution. It meant license for the foreign priests to display themselves during their sacrifices, in their mad frenzies, dancing, leaping, gesticulating, cutting and tearing their flesh. It was a sore sight to the little band of, this writer says, Yahwist's patriots, to watch the painted priests of Baal wailing and whirling in the high places of Israel in adoration of imported gods and goddesses. It grieved them more to note the growing popularity of the cult. And in today's, and I'm going to try and read a little more, but you see that in this society, and you'll see it in our society. The tolerant, we're always preached at. Well, we need to be tolerant of this. That I think was a cupcake bakery or something like that. Well, the homosexual need to come in here, and you need to be tolerant to let them have a cake. Tolerance is preached quite widely these days. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I'm trying not to talk the whole time. Amen. All right. Thank you, Nathaniel. I'm getting there. Good point, Ronnie. Page 240 for me. All right. Now, okay, remember the trading card and how I said that marrying her was getting to Tyre and getting their resources. All the evidence suggests that Israel, under the Amorites, I think that's how you say that, enjoyed a considerable material prosperity. That was Ahab and his line, the Amorites. Best witness to this is the new capital at Samaria. The site, which was a tall hill, ideally defensible, had been purchased by Omri, 1 Kings 16:24, and was, like Jerusalem, crown property. Archaeology has shown that the city begun by Omri and completed by Ahab had fortifications unequaled in ancient Palestine for excellence of workmanship. Ivory inlays found in one of the buildings may illustrate the ivory house that Ahab is said to have built. I get there because I'm again explaining the marriage that Solomon had to all of these, to all of his brides, and the marriage of Ahab to Jezebel and other wives. It was all keeping that money in Israel for the kings to keep it going. So it was a prosperous time, but as he said, here we go. But in spite of these evidences of wealth and strength, one gains the impression from certain narratives in Kings, which certainly reflect conditions accurately, that the lot of the peasantry had deteriorated. How onerous the regular exactions of the state where we have no way of saying, but there are signs of a progressive disintegration of the structure of Israelite society, and of a harsh system that tended to place the poor, now listen to this line, that tended to place the poor at the mercy of the rich. The former forced in hard times to borrow from the latter at usurious rates of interest. If you will, look at 2 Kings 4, verse 1. Anybody want to read that? So now that the father had died, the creditor comes to her house, says, well, since you can't pay your bills, I'll take your 2 boys. They'll be my slaves. This was happening all throughout society, as is written in the scripture in this time. Okay, now tolerance leads to it's my way or the highway. which is where Jezebel once again comes in. It says here, the religious crisis of Jezebel, however, was far more serious, however, was the crisis precipitated by the religious policy of the Omrites. As we have seen, the alliance with Tyre was sealed by Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, a worshipper of Tyrian deities, Baal and Asherah. Jezebel was naturally allowed, together with her retainers and the merchants who followed her in the interest of trade, to continue the practice of her native religion on Israelite soil. A temple to Baal was built for the purpose in Samaria. I think we read that, 1 Kings 16:32. This was no more than Solomon had done for his wives in 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 8, and something that the ancient mind would tend to accept as a matter of course. It is probable that only the narrow-minded objected. Who's the narrow-minded? Those are the worshippers of God. But Jezebel, who was a strong-minded woman, filled with an almost missionary zeal for her God, and no doubt contemptuous of the cultural backwardness and austere religion of her adopted land, apparently sought to make the cult of Baal the official religion of Israel. And so I wanted to say a few things on that, if you all don't have any comments, questions. Well, if you look at the way we are today and how we're supposed to be accepting of, again, homosexual marriages, and we're supposed to be accepting of the whole LGBT community. It's every, I don't even want to know. But it's those folks that come out in those parades, and then you hear of those lectures where they start beating you up because you disagree with them. They start taking care of it. Now Jezebel went on to great lengths to silence those who opposed her. And if somebody will read 1 Kings 18 verse 4, did I already? So she cut off the prophets, but also, probably, let me read, if you don't mind, 1 Kings 22. Well, that's another point. Let me gain my place here. Okay, so at this point, you have. I feel like we skipped something. At this point, you have some prophets who are now giving lip service to the king, and those who are telling the truth are being silenced or being told they're mean. In verse 3, now the king of Israel said to his servants, "Do you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and we are still doing nothing to take it out of the hand of the king of Aram?" And he said to Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to battle at Ramoth Gilead?" And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." This was going to turn out bad for these two. Moreover, Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Please inquire first for the word of the Lord." Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them, "Shall I go against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain?" And they said, "Go up. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king." Now remember, they're speaking to the king, and they're afraid. But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not yet a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of him?" The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, this is funny, "There is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." But Jehoshaphat said, "Let not the king say so. I hate him because he tells the truth." Has anybody experienced that kind of thing, where you're hated because you told the truth on on Prove All Things last night, I can tell you we're getting a lot of comments on this whole preterist position and how the 70 ADers really don't like us. So much so that I think John Watson refuses to speak to us on the phone or in person, but will be glad to chat on the chat room. But there's that hate there between people who have differing opinions all the time. And I think, yeah, yeah, yeah. You can be real quick to hit that button if you don't like what. I just saw a thing on Facebook where they've got a block bad comments button. So, and the comment was "you're ugly." Well, what if the comment is "you're sinning"? You shouldn't be with that woman. They can block them. It's the truth, but they can block them pretty easy. Let me read this. 1 Kings 1, excuse me, 1 Kings 18. Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, "Go show yourself of Ahab, and I'll send rain on the face of the earth." This is after 3 years of no rain. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now he feared the Lord, for when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets that hid them by 50s in a cave. Can you imagine us in this church having to hide in a cave, being fed with just bread and water to survive? Because the king or somebody hated you so much. So they divided the land between them to survey it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way. Now, as Obadiah was on the way, behold, Elijah met him. He recognized him and fell on his face and said, "Is that you, Elijah, my master?" He said to him, "It is I. Go say to your master, behold, Elijah is here." That's a funny story. But I feel like I don't have time. But we could read the story of Jezebel telling, and this is just more of the revolt, really, of the Omrides versus the common people, and that's what is happening in this scripture. That's what's happening with Jezebel and Elijah and Elisha. Elijah dies in the middle of this before Jezebel dies. Elisha takes over, and that's something that didn't occur to me when I was first reading the scripture, is that Elijah passes on and Jezebel is left to Elisha to deal with. Yeah. Well, I mean, you get this where the 10 Commandments are being ripped out of the courtyards because it's associated with the Bible. You get that. Ronnie's done some sermons on where things have been. You don't want to publicize that there are biblical things in Washington D.C. because you're afraid that some other group will get mad and take those and want those things disposed of because they have anything to do with the Bible. So. Yes. What you see here with this with Ahab and Jezebel is that they led for a period of time. They were very prosperous. But while they were prosperous, the other group was getting anxious, was not being listened to. And you have, after the revolt, after Jezebel dies, and we'll get to that, but after all of that, for a time, not for very long, for a time, Israel goes back to God. But they have their ups and downs. And so it is, like you say, it is a warning. And that's what the Old Testament is all about. It's a warning to us as Christians today to be mindful of what's happened in our past and apply it to us today. Did the Israelites survive this? Yes. They came out, sort of. But they took a toll. Continued opposition to the Amorites. In Israel, meanwhile, opposition to the house of Omri continued to mount. Its leader was Elijah's successor, Elisha, who carried forward the aims of Elijah. Like Samuel long before, Elisha worked in close cooperation with such of the prophetic orders. They continued to resist the policy of the state. These prophets afford us an insight into the nature of the reaction that was brewing. For instance, we find groups of them living a communal life. If you look at 2 Kings 2, verses 3 and verses 5, verses 4:38 through 44, you see as Elijah is trying to get away from Elisha. And as he's doing so, Elisha keeps saying, "No, I'm going to stay with you till you're gone." And he goes with him. And in all these cities, prophets come out. Prophets come out in little communal groups to see Elijah and Elisha and warn Elisha that Elijah is leaving. That's what that's all about. Anyway, they were distinguished by the hair mantle of their office, and apparently also by distinctive marking. They would give their oracles in groups, which is why they would come out in groups as Elijah was dying. Elevated to, elevated to ecstasy by music and dance, and for these they would usually expect a fee. Their demeanor caused many to think them mad. Now we're talking about the priests, the actual priests. 2 Kings 9, verse 11. Now and then they were the object of jeers, and you can see that on Elijah's return trip after Elijah has left, has been taken away by the chariot of fire. And look at 2 Kings 9, verse 11. And 9, verse 11 says there, Hiram. Now Jehu came out to the servants. Second Kings 2. Y'all can correct me anytime. 2 Kings 2, 23 through 25. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, young lads came out from the city, mocked him, and said to him, "Go up, you bald head, go up." No comment. When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. He went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. You can go, I'm sure all of you have a story of someone who you knew, a friend, or maybe not even a friend, who was an acquaintance, and they say to you, what are you doing? What are you doing going to church 2 times Sunday? Why are you going to do it? Why do you go on Wednesday nights? What's the purpose? What's the point? And they deride you. They mock you in their own sort of pleasant way. They did the same thing to Elisha at this time. Anyway, they were, however, zealous patriots, following the armies of Israel in the field, encouraging the king to fight the nation's wars, and desiring that these be conducted according to the rules of holy war. Elisha himself was called the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. One might say the man was worth divisions. All of the bad things that Jezebel did, and I haven't gone over them. You're welcome to point out a scripture and read it here at this point if you like. All of those things come to an end in 2 Kings 9. God wins this battle. Jehu comes back. Jehu is now anointed to be king. He carries out a long-planned revolution. He had every quality to ensure success. He was alert, ambitious, and his immense energy was indicated by the watchman's cry, which became proverbial. He drives like Jehu. An emissary from Elisha anointed him king, and the officers of the army at once proclaimed him. And he acted quickly. He started in hot haste for Jezreel, 30 miles away. 2 kings came forward to meet him in the field of Naboth. Carefully laid plans of Elisha were consummated. Jehu denounced the king as a tool of Jezebel. When he turned to flee, Jehu shot an arrow through his heart. The body was left in the field to be disposed of by the dogs. The bewildered king of Judah was also overtaken and mortally wounded before he could reach his own kingdom. Jezebel, now a venerable grandmother, courageous to the end, determined to die like a queen. Attired in all her finery, she taunted Jehu when he approached the palace. But notice, Jehu wasn't the one who killed Jezebel. She was flung down into the court by her eunuchs at the command of Jehu, who drove his chariot and horses over her body. After dinner, when his men went out to bury her, they found that the prophecy of Elijah had been fulfilled. The dogs had done their work. Nothing could be found of her body except a few morsels in a skull. Dad always says that the Bible is one of the most interesting reads that a person can come across. That it's very informative, that it tells you things, that it keeps your interest. And I can tell you that through reading the history of this revolt, which is what it was, this was a revolt against Jezebel and against that monarchy. And it all came to God's people exacting vengeance on the idols that were being formed, and the wives that came in that should not have been dictating policy. In 2 Kings 9, verse 29 through 37, I'm going to stop. Brian, you want to read? Can you read that? Yep. one last passage, and then I think I'll end it. But this is called the blood purge of Jehu. Revolution came in, this book says 842. Superficially, it took the form of a coup d'etat by the general Jehu. Actually, as its violence indicates, it was an explosion of pent-up popular anger, and of all that was conservative in Israel against the Amorite house and its entire policy. According to the narrative, it was Elisha who applied the match. Taking advantage of the absence of Jehoram, who was in Jezreel recuperating from wounds, he dispatched one of the sons of the prophets to army headquarters in Ramoth Gilead with orders to anoint Jehu king. When Jehu's officers learned what had happened, they forthwith acclaimed him. One observes once again the traditional pattern of kingship by prophetic designation and popular acclamation. Albeit acclamation in this case was actually by the army only. Jehu mounts his chariot, drove with all speed to Jezreel. Jehoram, accompanied by his kinsman Ahaziah, who had that year succeeded to the throne of Judah and who had participated in the action at Ramoth Gilead, drove out to meet him. Jehu, without parley, drew his bow, struck Jehoram dead. Ahaziah, fleeing, was likewise struck down. Jehu then entered Jezreel, and having had Jezebel thrown from a window, set about exterminating not only the entire family of Ahab, but all in the way connected with his court as well. The coup d'etat rapidly turned into a bloodbath. Moving on to Samaria, Jehu encountered a delegation from the court in Jerusalem, and with wanton brutality and for no apparent reason, slaughtered them all. Finally, having arrived in the capital, he enticed the worshippers of Baal into their temple on pretext of offering sacrifice, turned his soldiers loose on them, and butchered them to the last man. It was a purge of unspeakable brutality beyond excuse from a moral point of view, which had, as we all see, disastrous consequences. But the cult of Baal had been exterminated. Yahweh would remain, at least officially, the God of Israel. I hope I said something that made sense, really. The history is impressive, but the history, if you apply it to what you're seeing here, as the church gets smaller, it seems it gets smaller. The more we go underground, how much can we take before something like this before that happens, before a revolt of epic proportion happens? No, I don't see a bloodbath anytime in our future, but I do see us going underground sometimes, and I wonder if that's what we should be doing. I wonder if we should not be more public about our thoughts and our intents. And that's how I'll leave.